This largely forgotten about camera packs an incredible range of features into a tiny, lightweight frame, but everyone seems to have forgotten about it. But funny enough, that's actually not a bad thing, because you see, this means that these are now relatively easy to get your hands on and can be purchased for a relatively low price. Now, I managed to win my copy in an auction on Buyee for around 28,380 Japanese yen, which is around £155 or 198 US dollars. But if you don't have time to mess around with auctions, then I've also seen a number of them for sale on eBay going for between $200 and $250, including shipping. So what is this camera? What makes it so good? And if it is so good, why is it so cheap? Well, this is the Olympus OM-D E-M10, and if you didn't already know, a few years ago, Olympus was somewhat forced into selling off its camera division after years of financial scandal and lawsuits. The company that bought the camera division decided to rebrand and restructure what was left of the company in order to give it a fresh new start. And these days they go by the name of OM System. So why am I telling you this? Well, because the current focus has now shifted onto this new company, new consumers have either entirely forgotten about or simply haven't heard of these original Olympus brand cameras, and so they seem to get completely overlooked. Those photographers who haven't forgotten, well, sadly a lot of them seem to just simply discard or disregard them as old and outdated tech, which I think is a huge mistake for reasons we'll get onto. As for why this specific model is so cheap, well, this is the original E-M10 model, and it was only the third mirrorless camera that Olympus produced all the way back in 2014. Since then, there have been 3 other iterations after this, ending with 2020's E-M10 Mark IV, and this was very much designed as an entry-level camera with a reasonably low price tag. And compared to some other entry-level options released around the same time, this E-M10 is pretty feature-laden. It actually poaches some of the tech from its flagship sibling, the E-M1. It has the same processor and 81-point AF system, which, despite being contrast detect only, is quick and accurate. But probably the most impressive thing about this tiny camera is that it also includes a 3-axis IBIS system for helping to keep your shots shake-free when shooting handheld. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't quite as powerful as the 5-axis system on the flagship E-M1, but when shooting out in the field, not once did I feel like this was a compromise, and it was more than up to the job. Now, despite this having a very small frame and my hands being not so small,
my hands tell a story of greatness.
I actually find this camera incredibly comfortable to shoot with. I mean, they've really not reinvented the wheel here. All they've done is added a generously sized thumb rest at the back, and then also added a modest lump on the front here, and that's all you need to provide enough purchase without compromising the retro aesthetic too much. Something that, unfortunately, even modern releases don't get 100% correct all of the time, and often require the help of third-party accessories to fix that. Now, just above this thumb rest, there are 2 very large command dials which rotate with a super satisfying click, and for such a small camera this is absolutely jam-packed with physical buttons and dials, most of which can be customized to suit your own shooting style. Whilst it doesn't have a joystick on the back for moving around the active AF point, which is always my preferred method, the generously sized 3-inch screen on the back is at least touch sensitive, so you can move the point around using your finger instead. Oh, and this screen can also pull out and tilt to aid with shooting low from the hip, which is handy for street photography, but also from above for a bird's eye perspective. Now, above the screen, there's a built-in EVF, which is handy in bright sunny conditions, but what makes this camera somewhat unique is this. It has a pop-up flash. In fact, this was the first OM-D camera to include a pop-up flash, though there is also a full-sized hot shoe on the top here for attaching a larger one should you need it in the future. This means for casual or budding street and travel photographers, this honestly ticks most of the boxes. It's small, lightweight, and feature-laden, but what's the image quality like? Well, before we can dive into that, I first need to mention today's sponsor, and that's Storyblocks. With one subscription, you can get unlimited downloads of royalty-free stock media, including 4K videos, music, sound effects, templates, and more, all in one place. Personally, one of the biggest challenges that I find with video editing is not having enough B-roll to keep the story flowing. But instead of spending more time shooting a bunch of new footage, I know that I can rely on Storyblocks to help me find the perfect shots in just a few minutes. And with their clear-cut licensing, everything I download is protected and ready to use, so I have no worries about copyright issues further down the road. Plus, their library is constantly refreshed with diverse, high-quality quality content from talented artists, so I'm never short of options. So be sure to check out Storyblocks by heading to the website on screen now or by checking out the link in the video description, and a huge thank you to Storyblocks for helping to support this channel by sponsoring this video. Anyway, inside this EM10, it features a 16 megapixel 4/3 sensor with a proper mechanical shutter, though sadly this is also why many people will write this camera off before even trying it. No, it's not the megapixel count, because 16 megapixels is plenty of resolution for posting online and producing modest sized prints. To find the answer, you usually don't have to venture all that far into the comments section of videos like this before you'll find a handful of people who are very quick to denounce all micro 4/3 cameras based on nothing more than the size of the sensor alone. Personally, I've never struggled making the most of tiny equipment, but some people seem a real issue with it. I can't imagine why. Now, whilst back in the day, tiny chips like this did sometimes come with their drawbacks, increased digital noise usually being the main offender here. As I've said many times before on this channel, we now live with the luxury of having stuff like AI noise reduction at our disposal. So with the click of a button, even the most deeply entrenched noise is removed in an instant, which I think could see a resurgence for this type of camera. Either way, the raw images that I captured with this EM10 produced nice colors straight out of the camera, and when editing them afterwards in Lightroom, they were still plenty flexible enough, allowing me to pull back details from the shadows and highlights with ease. Sure, I did see a little bit of noise cropping up, but nothing that I would regard as really offensive. Now, all of that said, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that this camera is completely without fault, because let's face it, which camera is? And so that means this camera does inevitably have a handful of drawbacks, which you should be made aware of. Firstly, it absolutely sucks for video capture. The options consist of 1080p HD at 30 frames per second, and well, yeah, that's it. There's not even an option for 24 or 25 frames per second, which is a little bit weird. So this is very much a photography only kind of camera. Now, the second issue is with continuous burst mode. Whilst on paper, this can capture images as fast as 8 frames per second, what that doesn't really tell you is while shooting at this speed, the autofocus is completely shut off. So it'll focus for the first frame, but then after that, the AF will just go on strike and sit and not do anything. For things like sports and wildlife, where your subject is probably constantly moving around, that's not ideal. Now, you can drop this speed to 3 frames per second, and that will allow you to retain full continuous AF functionality. But let's be honest, you aren't going to be capturing any high octane sports at that kind of speed. And for some reason, it will only splutter out a handful of shots before completely stopping. And I honestly can't find any settings within the camera that might be limiting this. And it's certainly not the buffer, because it will allow you to release the shutter button and continue afterwards straight away. So who knows, but either way, this clearly isn't geared for any kind of fast-paced shooting. But I honestly think that's okay, because we are looking at this as a potential street or travel camera, in which case you really don't need to be firing off a million shots a second. Finally, this specific model is well known for having an issue where on some copies, the mode dial will just completely stop functioning after a while. And that means you're stuck shooting in either manual mode or whatever mode you shot with last. Now, the good news is that you can obviously still use the camera in that state. However, with this being an older camera, the likelihood of you actually getting that fixed is pretty slim. So just be mindful of this before buying, and make sure you get one that doesn't have this problem. But if you are able to see past these slight technical issues and you can pick up a fault-free version, in my opinion, this miniature masterpiece could very well be one of the best budget cameras you can currently buy.